I think the sense was in, say, October 97, when, as you say, Sinn Féin entered the talks. Tony Blair is there, you're there, George Mitchell, assisted by John de Shastlin and Harry Holkery, are chairing. And now David Trimble comes in with the support, if you recall, of the two loyalist parties, the PUP, David Irvine, and the UDP. There was a sense that we now, in sporting parlance, game on. And I think that I'd say in fairness, it was, you've always said this to us, and I do want to take the opportunity to pay tribute to you as our boss. You know, it was a phenomenal honour to work with you and to observe at close quarters. And because this is about future generations and young people out there, I do want to say that the power of the leadership shown by Tony Blair and yourself as the leaders, and the rest of us had, took our cue from that. Like was to be honest with you, was absolutely fundamental and pivotal to the whole thing. And I know politicians get a tough, get a tough going of it. But as a civil servant, I was privileged to be in the room. I saw with my own eyes, and I want to take the opportunity to say that. So I think the leadership, and I often think Tony Blair and yourself, we were very fortunate. You guys came in. You were both in your 40s. And you had a real sense of energy and momentum, and also a bit of a sense that you were experienced politicians as well, though you knew there was a time and a tide here now, while you were still relatively new in office, that you could do this. And there was another 40-something, if you recall, across the Atlantic that we should mention as well, Bill Clinton, and his interest in that, I think, was a key factor as well. If I'm describing the surrounding factors, we had a president of the United States putting all of the prestige of the United States and the behind this as well. So the sense was of momentum and an opportunity. However, at the same time, because it's 25 years ago now, I also say, though, it was extraordinarily difficult. And I'm not trying to say that now like, oh my God, we're actually, you know what? There was also a sense throughout that time, about the scale of the difficulties that we were trying to tackle and to overcome and find a way through. Because here's a very simple statistic: it had never been done. There had never been, certainly in the modern era, a successful negotiations involving the governments and the parties. Yes, there had been. Obviously, there was the attempt at Sunningdale, which failed, and obviously the Anglo-Irish Agreement was there in 1985, but that was just between the two governments. There had never been a successful outcome like this. So you were basically trying to break a mold. So the wind and the hill and the rain, I'd say, were against. But so those two things were kind of almost like the countervailing forces in play: a sense of momentum and urgency, and at the same time a deep sense of the scale of what was trying to be overcome. And one other thing, just to remind, I guess, young people as well, listen to this, is that we were coming off the back of, because context is everything. The context is we were at the end of a 25, 30 years of a conflict that had cost the deaths of 3,500 people, thousands more injured and maimed, and a huge trauma on the whole place. And when I was driving here today, I drove past Talbot Street, and I was sitting at the traffic lights just looking at the sign Talbot Street, and it just came back to me that on the 17th of May 1974, there were, at 5 o'clock on a Friday evening, people were walking down that street, a lot of them getting the bus at Busaras, and a bomb went off and 14 people were killed and dozens more injured, and lives changed forever just in that street. That's just one incident. You could repeat that all the way. That's just here in Dublin, look at Northern Ireland. So we were coming off the back of horrendous trauma, death and destruction, and I think there was a sense that there was a responsibility on you overall as the political leaders, and then the rest of us, the officials supporting you, that we have to find a way to break what I would call the cycle of history. And that was the scale of that. So I think that was the mood. And then off we go. And then I think there's two other things I want to say about the setup that you led, which is that what was different about these talks was a number of things. First of all, they were inclusive in the sense that they had a much wider range of people around the table, and they were comprehensive in terms of the issues on the table. So it's simpler, actually, all right, if you keep it down to 2 or 3 issues, but the problem with that is that's not going to cover the basis upon which you can find an agreement that everybody can sign up to. So I think there was a much wider range of people around the table, and that, of course, complexifies things. But it means that most people that are in need are in the room, and then secondly, comprehensiveness of the issues. So I suppose in the course of that autumn, then in the winter, there's this big range of issues that have to be addressed, and it was kind of structured then on the basis of, if you recall, the three. So there was a kind of a basket of issues. There was a constitutional question, which was huge. There was the whole question of the institutions, and they were being divided up into those three strands. Relations. This was a John Hume concept, really. The three strands, which was relations within Northern Ireland, relations between North and South and the island of Ireland, and then relations between Ireland and Britain. So they were the three strands, and so the discussions were taking place across all those. And then there was a range of other issues as well, which have to do with, if you like, the ending of conflict, what to do about prisoners, what to do about weapons, reform of police, reform of the administration of justice, economic and social rights, and so on. And then a very interesting development and again, I think John Hume came up with this idea, was that for the first time ever, at the end of these talks, they were going to be put to the people in referendum. So this was a very kind of a novel concept as well, and a very important kind of part of it. So all of that. So if you like, at any one time, you were you and Tony Blair, obviously working with George Mitchell, who played such an important role as well. But really, to be frank, it was the two governments, and it was you and Tony Blair had to drive the search then through working away sort of systematically, painfully through all of those issues into detail, looking at this piece, all of it aimed at trying to find a framework in the end that everybody not necessarily could agree with in a way, but could live with.
Decommissioning was a big political issue for all of us. I mean, it took us a long time to get there, and we went through various phases, getting agreement first of all and bringing in legislation to set up an international body of decommissioning, which the legislation was passed in Dáil Éireann and passed in Westminster. John de Chastelaine, who chaired that. And then that went on for some years, and we had the interim position where arms would be put beyond use but wouldn't be decommissioned, when we brought in Cyril Ramaphosa and Matti Ahtisaari. So I think that worked its way through, and I suppose the only trouble with the decommissioning issue was that it took too long.
Yes.
And that was a.
But I think I suppose decommissioning is almost like it was. As somebody said, decommissioning wasn't really about decommissioning. It was really about actually a fundamental absence of trust, and also a fundamental, almost philosophical standoff between two positions, which is that I guess on the Republican side is that physical force is a sacred instrument, which is part of the foundation of our state as well, the proclamation, physical force, and therefore arms are the expression of physical force. And decommissioning is historically, I guess, a sign of surrender. That's what you do. The way that you and Tony Blair set up, there's nobody surrendering here. This is not about victory or defeat. So I think psychologically, both, if you like, and from a theological point of view, the disposal of weapons was a really sensitive, difficult theological issue. And the concept of decommissioning had always got the whiff of surrender about it, and there's going to be no surrender. And that, I think no surrender was a sort of a shared principle across both worlds in a way. So that's kind of what we were dealing with here. And I think trying to crack that one, and let's face it, we had the complexity as well as that Sinn Féin is there, part of the wider Republican movement, shall we say, of which the IRA is also a part, and yet they're separate. So the phrase in the Good Friday Agreement under the heading of constructive ambiguity is that parties will use their influence, to bring about decommissioning. And I suppose, the question would be, if you unpack constructive ambiguity, what does that mean? What does it mean to use your influence? Do you have to be successful or not successful? If I say I've used my influence, but I wasn't successful, but I have implemented what I said I was going to do, which is use my influence. You didn't say, so there were all these, as I say, ambiguities, which were a necessary part of bringing about agreement. And I think that in the end, there was this kind of dance going on, I suppose basically between, in the end it kind of boiled down to being Sinn Féin and the UUP, around this whole trust around, and it crystallized into around weapons, but actually was a wider absence of trust piece that was playing out. And of course, the great thing you had is you were talking to everybody, and you had a tremendous, and I saw it at first hand, a great relationship of trust with David Trimble, and sadly, he's passing recently as a terrible loss for us all. But you were able to build those relationships of trust, but they didn't exist right across the board. And of course, as we know, the UUP and Sinn Féin didn't speak to each other directly during the negotiations.
Not for the whole day.
Yeah, the biggest thing that was achieved by the Good Friday Agreement, in my view, and under your leadership and that of Tony Blair, and credit to you forever, is that we stopped the killing. We basically stopped the killing. So as I drive past Talbot Street today, and just sitting there thinking about those poor people and and I just people walking past, people today can live their lives more or less. Like, there's no society that's perfect. There's no scenario anywhere that's perfect. Of course, there are problems, but fundamentally, we can now go about living lives, and people can grow up and have their dreams and so fundamentally, there's been a transformation. Now, having said all of that, there are still big issues around the fundamentals here of two political philosophies that essentially see the world in a very different way, called unionism, nationalism. And I hope the pact we have made is we will never again resort to the gun to settle those differences. But in every other respect, it's still, it's still game on. As I say, we haven't convinced unionism that this is the wonderful pathway, and they haven't convinced nationalism that their way is the wonderful way. So we are back to where you had us, 25 years ago. Our task is to find a way that through this fundamental, almost contradictory situation, that everybody can live with. But I think if we can continue the progress we've made in these 25 years and continue to build on that going forward, I just think that there's a tremendous future ahead for the island. And I suppose the last thing I'd say is it's down to people and relationships at the end of the day. And I suppose the privilege for me, say, in the 5.5 years in Armagh, where I'm working in my daily job with fellow civil servants from the Northern Ireland Civil Service, Catholic, Protestant, Orangeman. There was an Orangeman in the team. And the Orangeman was a man called Tom Kerr at the back door. And if I'm running out to a meeting, I'm dashing off down to meet you or something. And he'd say to me, "Tim, go back there and get your coat. It's very cold out there, I couldn't quite look at, Tom Kerr is my friend. He's an Orangeman, he's my friend. And so, and all right across the board, and working with my Northern colleagues, Dick McKenzie, Peter Smith, and we had the chance to actually work together. And I think, the relationships that you had with David Trimble, so it's back down at the end of the day to people. We have to find a way. And I suppose I leave the last word to my old friend Seamus Mallon, Lord Merson, who died a couple of years ago. His last work was, what was the title of his book? It was Shared Home Place. Our task is to find a way that we can share this place that we all love.